Okay. This is a summer school on the philosophy of the Rosicrucian Fellowship. And because of this focus on the Rosicrucian philosophy, all of the presentations have to be by people who are committed to following that path of attainment, as set down by Max Heindel, who was the messenger and founder of the Rosicrucian Fellowship from the Rosicrucian Order. The Rosicrucian Order is an esoteric organization from out of the inner worlds. And the only way you can join the Rosicrucian Order is to be spiritually fit and able to leave your body and live such a life that you can resonate to that kind of a high vibration. No, vibration is not a very good word. When we say things like this, this doesn't mean that other spiritual paths are wrong. But it's only to say that you can't tune yourself to two different tuning forks. And each mystery school has its own tuning fork. And if you try to tune to two of them, you cannot tune to either of them. It's also not to say that one must affiliate with a mystery school or a feeder to a mystery school. Because spiritual development means freedom. And freedom in such a way that you can follow or pursue any path of development however you want. However, it must be stated that any investigation into the evolutionary creation from any of the mystery schools indicates that more of our spiritual future is in unity rather than in continuing on separative individualism, which proves to be tangential. So the wisest course seems to be developing freely and associating freely with other people and respecting them and working together. Sort of the way an orchestra works or a team works or something like that. We all work together in unity. I have been trying to do this now for just about 52 years, and in fact more than 52 years, and I have found that trying to work together with other people and having the fellowship of the Spirit has been nothing but a joy. There are trials, because when we are trying to grow, we are put against people who are of a common persuasion. It makes it very difficult. We are, there has never been a monastery, even the Pythagoreans on Crotona, never has been where there hasn't been some struggle between people. But that's how we grow. We learn to love and persevere in love despite differences in struggle. So I have no hesitation in inviting whoever would like to join us in this spiritual quest. Now, the Rosicrucian philosophy that we follow is not just another intellectual worldview. It's based on painstaking observation and investigation with many, many corroborations. This is all done by well-trained and well-developed clairvoyants. There is a philosophical spirit about the Rosicrucian movement, but it is actually as much science as it is philosophy. The Rosicrucian method of development for means of attaining consciousness of the spiritual worlds is based on the principles that are the basis of the evolutionary creation itself. In short, we are a product of that evolutionary creation, and therefore we respond to the principles by which we were created and by which the whole creation has been formed. So this is, the Rosicrucian methods are like technology. In the same way that electronics is a manifestation of the understandings of physics, Rosicrucian methods are the consequence of understanding the principles behind the creation. Now, if we adhere to the Rosicrucian philosophy very strictly, it doesn't mean that it should be treated like a religious dogma or something like that, that this is true once and for all. We do not want to leave one kind of dogma to form another. We don't want to become creed-bound. A philosophy that has evolution in the center of its philosophy has to itself evolve. If it doesn't evolve, and if it isn't improved, if it isn't extended, if new things are not developed in it, it's hardly an evolutionary philosophy. Even if we are not ourselves very creative people, so that we can continue on the work of the great Rosicrucian teachers, we should be able to at least see old principles in new ways. This has to be new. Exactly the way Christ says, or the Christ figure in the book of Revelation, where it says, "Behold, I make all things new." So we have to avoid the two extremes. One of being wandering aimlessly through the cosmos and picking and choosing what we like, or becoming creed-bound and very strict and not growing. Now, after saying all of this, I have to confess that I have no heart for pure Rosicrucian philosophy as an entity in itself. I can't cut that. A philosophy is a means to understand reality and to live in harmony with reality. And reality is what it is all about. And if a philosophy does not point to reality, it's not worth much. You know, a philosophy can be logically consistent, and it can be beautiful, it can have an eloquent or elegant quality to it, but if it doesn't give a clear, useful view of reality, it isn't worth anything. So I've been working with the Rosicrucian philosophy a little over 52 years, and I have to say that it's got a pretty good batting average as far as relating to reality. In fact, it has a very high batting average as far as I've been able to follow it out in relating to reality. But that said, I'm only a beginner, and so my experience may not mean much. We're almost through. We're at the fourth introduction. Pretty soon all the introductions will be over. In fact, that's going to be introduction on introduction tonight. We are sharing a quest to try and understand and live in harmony with reality using the Rosicrucian philosophy. And in doing that, I have been selecting a topic each year for the last 10 years. And that, for these summer schools. 2 years ago, I decided that all of the most important basic studies in Rosicrucian philosophy that I had covered, especially the important things like building the soul body and things like that. So I decided that I was going to repeat in a cycle of 10 years. But plans don't always work like that. It's like Bobby Burns, the poet, says, "The best laid plans, O mice in men, oft gang agley." This is from a poem he wrote where he was plowing and he plowed into a mouse nest, and he says, "My plans and the mouse's plans, it wasn't what either of us expected." So what happens is that each year something new fascinates me. And I want to share what is fascinating to me with other people. And I try to keep it within the bounds of fundamentals in Rosicrucian philosophy, so that this is not about my interests, but that it is about the Rosicrucian philosophy. I've decided that merely doing the old things over again without doing something completely new with them is not right. It's not fair to anyone, because the poet Robert Frost said, "If there are no surprises for the poet, there will be no surprises for the reader." And that is a principle that I think relates to what we're trying to do. If this isn't new to us, and if it isn't fresh to us, and if it isn't a rediscovery to us, how can we possibly hope to share the spiritual excitement with other people? So in order to keep things interesting, it has to be interesting to me. And this year has not been an exception. And it all came about when I decided to offer an advanced course in astrology. For the first time in 40-some years to offer an advanced course. And I don't know how I had the cheek 40 years ago to try to offer an advanced course. It's sort of laughable. And in preparing to do that, I always believe that astrology has to be as much about life and about people as it is about astrology. Otherwise, it just becomes a dry, technical study and there's nothing to it. And this is what happens with most astrology. They describe behavior of people, but they have no understanding of it. And a lot of them don't even have a love for people, at least not a demonstrable love for people. And so this is what I try to avoid. So I decided that for this course it was going to be a study of understanding human psychology. Now, in that, modern psychology is of little help. Basically, it is an extension of physiology and of pharmacology. There's not really any psychology in it. At best, there are these little studies that say, presented a given situation, more people tend to prefer to do this rather than that. And that's not necessarily giving you an understanding into what's going on in the soul of someone. There's little analysis as to why things are as they are, and why people do what they do. Also, there is little investigation into the structure of the soul, which mysticism does so excellently. And, in fact, modern psychology doesn't even believe in a soul. They should just call it ology, because the psyche is no longer in it. It's not part of that reality. So as a result, modern, what's called contemporary psychology, is more of a study of the brain and the nervous system. And the materialistic scientists have been very exacting, and they've been very good about that. There's one psychologist who has found what he calls the God spot. And he can activate a spot in your brain, and you feel you've had a mystical experience because that spot in the brain has been activated. And he'll challenge anyone that he can bring them to that experience. And so he poo-poos mysticism as being superstitious, and that people who have mystical experiences are having chance neural events in their brains. Obviously, he doesn't believe in being able to bring about this kind of consciousness, which is what spiritual exercises are all about. And he fails to realize that what he calls the God spot is a portal for bringing mystical experience into our physical bodies. And that portal has to be able to simulate in our bodies what we are experiencing from beyond our bodies. And he doesn't, that thought never dawns on him. So modern psychology is really not psychology. So if we want to study psychology, we have to, as pure psychology, what's going on in the soul, we have to go back almost a century. We have to go back to the times of Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung. There have been advances that have been made by Erik Erikson, for example, and some of the psychoanalysis has been fleshed out by Theodor Reich, but the basic ideas of depth psychology all go back to Freud and Jung. So for the last 25 years, I have been reading thousands of pages of the basic works of Freud and Jung. And currently I'm in the process of going through about 6 volumes of biography of Freud and Jung to know the little details of their lives. And along the way, I've gained some psychological understanding and the understanding of the way psychologists think. And one of those things that I've learned along the way is what psychologists, depth psychologists, call the unconscious. And the unconscious constitutes what the Rosicrucian philosophy would call the higher vehicles of consciousness. The vital body, the desire body, and the concrete mind. Not the spirit itself, which transcends all of that, but the vehicles. That would be what is called the psyche. It's true that we are conscious of our vital movements. We are conscious of our desire nature. If we're angry, we know it. And we're conscious of our thoughts to some extent. But the psychologists have been very clear in pointing out that the greater part of our soul nature we are unconscious to. And that's what I want to look at in these talks, but I want to look at that from the perspective of Rosicrucian Christian mysticism because it's much more satisfying and it's much deeper. Normally, the unconscious that is associated with our higher vehicles is called the personal unconscious. Carl Jung carries it further into what he would call the collective unconscious, which we would call the more macrocosmic spiritual world, except that his concept of that is not logically consistent, but that's neither here nor there. And it is all very primitive. It is not dealing with divinities and higher states of consciousness. So after all of these years of pondering depth psychology, I've become fascinated with the relationship between waking consciousness and unconsciousness. These are very enormous topics which you can go into great detail with, and there could be many, many lectures about them, but we have 5 to do just a very little bit. Now, what we're going to go into is not meant to be a pedantic or theoretical presentation. It is meant to be practical. Practical for people like ourselves as we're trying to grow spiritually. Because if we understand some of the machinations that go on in the unconsciousness of our psyche, we're much better able to fight the good fight and to overcome the adversary that is primarily focused in the desire body. It's not an adversary, it's just the part of the team that is rebellious. So this is the Rosicrucian philosophy goes very deeply into the unconscious, much more so than depth psychology does. And it has a very helpful and pragmatic way of going about it. It's different from the depth psychologists. Carl Jung, for example, did not believe that meditation of any form could help you with your unfoldment of consciousness. He never prayed. Sigmund Freud was an atheist. So we can see that they can only go so far, but they did marvelous things, as we're going to see as the week goes on. Now, several years ago, in one of these summer schools, the topic was consciousness. Not unconsciousness, but consciousness. And that was and still is a very engaging subject. Now, since that time, it's one of those things that once you share something, much more comes to you. Whereas if you hold things in yourself, they don't develop. Since that time, I've learned a good deal more about consciousness, but all of the things that were said several years ago still apply, but there's much, much more, but there really isn't time to go into it. Now, this series of talks is meant to be the complement of the series of talks on consciousness. And if you want recordings of those, I have plenty of recordings and they're available for free. Since that is the case, and since unconsciousness is a subset of consciousness in general, it's important that we review some of the very simple principles from those talks in the next few minutes and carry them out or have them in our consciousness that we can work with them. Now, one of the things that was said about consciousness, one of the things that was mentioned, is that consciousness is one of the few words that comes close to being an attribute of the Absolute. The Absolute is so far beyond any waking conscious being that we can't speak of it. We don't know. It's everything that is and everything that isn't, and you don't know. You just can't talk about the Absolute. But consciousness appears to be an underlayment between the known and the unknown. When the unknown becomes known, consciousness is not added on. The consciousness was there all along, it's just that we become aware of it. Coming to know something is a change in consciousness, but not the creation of consciousness. The consciousness has been there. It's sort of like one of those things. Oh, I knew that all along. When it comes to mind. So from this kind of experience, we can see that there are various different kinds of consciousness. And psychologists have been very good about recognizing different stages of consciousness and different ways of coming to consciousness. So there is waking consciousness, there is pre-consciousness, there is subconsciousness, there is threshold consciousness, there is unconsciousness, and many other grades along the general spectrum of what could be called altogether consciousness. The only thing that there isn't is non-consciousness. There is no such thing as non-consciousness. That's simply an empty intellectual concept. Consciousness just is. And it is experienced or not experienced in various ways. You can't manufacture consciousness, and it can't be painted onto existence. Existence is formed within consciousness. If it were something different or something separate that was added onto reality, there would always be a doubt about whether we knew that thing or didn't know that thing. If it wasn't part of a continuum, a unity that we all belong to, we wouldn't know anything about that. That's the torment that dualistic philosophers have. They never know that the other is part of what they are. Now, beside these different grades of consciousness, there are different flavors of consciousness. Several years ago, when we did the talks on consciousness, we did 5 talks about flavors of consciousness, and we looked at the flavors of consciousness through the specialization of consciousness in planetary qualities. That each planet has a flavor that's all of its own, and there can be waking self-consciousness of all the different flavors. Consciousness and unconsciousness are all about awareness and attention. Most of us, as ordinary human beings, are not highly aware of our attention and where we're focusing it, unless we are very deliberately placing our attention on something. We're not really aware of it. We stray, our consciousness wanders all over. And part of that diminished consciousness that tends to stray is due to attitude. When we are conscious, when we're awake, and we're aware of it, we think that's it. We're awake. We're awake to the reality of consciousness. There's nothing more. We don't need anything more. Of course, that is spiritually lazy, and it has a quality of self-satisfaction in it. Yet on some days, we realize that we are more consciously aware of what's going on than we are on other days. Experience teaches us that we are more conscious sometimes than at other times. It's a kind of a solipsism that we have in our egoism, that we think consciousness is as good, that our consciousness is as good as the consciousness of everyone else, which is not true, because when we meet somebody of greater consciousness or lesser consciousness, we can see it. It's obvious. I had experience a few years ago in Chicago of being with one of the most noted experts on the music of Duke Ellington. I had a very dear friend who was the lead dancer in the Jazz Nutcracker written by Duke Ellington. And the musical, I don't know what they call him, he was more than a conductor. He was sort of the musical generator of it all. And so my friend and this guy and I went out to a restaurant. And while we were sitting in the restaurant, there was jazz music playing in the background. And after a few minutes, he began to comment on that jazz music, and he brought our attention to the tone quality and to the balance and to several other factors like that. And it was as if a membrane was lifted off of my ears and off of my consciousness, and I could hear things in the music that I never knew were there before. And he not only knew those things, he was capable of bringing us to see or bringing us to hear those things. And that's a really good example of someone having, it's a specialized, but it's a greater consciousness. And there's no doubt then that some people in some ways are more conscious than other people. In fact, some people are more conscious all around than other people. Unfortunately, I lapsed back into the world of not being as conscious of music as I could be. And it's an ironic thing, because the music maven wanted to talk about social reactions because he wanted to talk about his horoscope. And he was not as conscious of social relations as he was of music. So it was a specialized kind of awareness. That's the sort of a thing with consciousness. It isn't all just general, except if we develop that way spiritually. Sometimes we can develop a consciousness of one kind that doesn't carry into all other things. Now, the Rosicrucian philosophy implies some very interesting things about awareness and attention in consciousness. It states that we as human beings are in the very early stages of waking objective self-consciousness. Waking objective self-consciousness is quite a mouthful, and so it needs some elucidation. So if we look at waking first, the simple question comes out. Hey, Jerry. There's one right back there. The simple question comes out. It's been asked by philosophers very often. How do we know that we're awake? Another way of getting at this is, how do we know that we're not asleep? Which is a different kind of consciousness, or a lower state of consciousness, that we're not asleep in a dream. After all, most of us have had a dream in which we wake up from that dream only to find out that we're in another dream. And sometimes that gets repeated several times before we wake up to here and now. When we do finally wake up, there's a feeling of relief, but it certainly brings a certain amount of insecurity about the quality of our waking consciousness if we can be fooled that easily. And that insecurity is not bad. It's a neurotic thing, but neurosis is common to the spiritual path. And it's that kind of uncertainty. I've known people that would go to bed crying because they didn't know certain truths. And we want light, more light. And that kind of uncertainty, where we want something that is sure, that we can rest our spirit in as being, as being the truth. Now, some people would say, I can pinch myself, and because I can pinch myself, I'm awake. Others would say, you can pinch yourself in a dream also. but it never happens. It's a theoretical argument that never really happens. Now, when we say that, I can pinch myself, that is much more profound and much more aware of what's going on than we realize. And let's be a little doctrinaire with the Rosicrucian philosophy. The Rosicrucian philosophy, by studying the evolutionary creation, it is said that the only time that we are in the life cycle keenly wide awake and capable of becoming more awake is when we are incarnated in our dense physical bodies. In fact, in the evolutionary creation, we didn't have waking self-consciousness until we had dense physical bodies. Before that, we had a consciousness, and we had a higher consciousness, and we have a higher consciousness after we die. But it isn't awake. There's sort of a hazy, dreamy thing about it. If you read things from mediumship, or they're called revealed writings, they're always thin. They don't have any sharpness. They don't have any saliency about them. And so I can almost always tell. Rosalie and I have been sharing writings from someone from the other side that I should have recognized it right away. It has that hazy quality about it. You know what I mean?
Yes. The Clark.
Yes. We are awake in our higher vehicles, but it's not the same thing. It's not sharp. It's not clear. It's almost like we're slightly dazed. Let's look at another part of waking objective self-consciousness. The self-knowing part of waking objective self-consciousness is that the waking is proven. When we can self-consciously intend to do something and carry it out without interruption, we know then that we are free agents. We are creative free agents. We are active free agents. It's surprising how hard it is to do that. To do everything that we do with full and complete intention and waking self-consciousness. Some people even claim that that's one of the best ways to wake up clairvoyance, is to do every last little thing. If you're putting a stamp on an envelope, you do that with complete waking self-consciousness, and that wakes you up to who you are, and you really are in touch with yourself and what you're doing. All day long we have a stream of consciousness, and it's not the stream of consciousness that is like being in a dream, but it's not the same thing. If I say that I'm going to take my finger and curl it like this and do it with every bit of intention in it, that is something very deliberate. In that there is a proving to ourselves. Ourself, our spiritual being, knows itself through its vehicles of consciousness. The vehicles of consciousness being the mind, the desire body, the vital body, and the physical body in which we move the finger. This is part of the famous philosophical treatise from the British empiricist, Bishop Berkeley. He says, I know that I'm awake because I can kick a stone and it hurts. And it's a way of proving to himself. Now this brings out the last feature of waking self-consciousness that is objective. the objectivity of it. If something is objective, it is provable. And not just to ourselves, because if we prove something to ourselves, we can be self-deluded. We can suggest things to ourselves that, wow, this is what things are. And a lot of people live their whole life in such a fantasy like that, and it's obvious to others around them that that isn't what's happening. Proving something is a rational way, and the Rosicrucian philosophy always tries to be logical and rational in everything that it does, of working and knowing with reality by working with the truth behind reality. That's a loaded statement. The idea is that we are separate selves, capable of knowing and creating and working within the truth of reality. If we can do something, and in doing that, we can prove to someone else, beyond doubt, we are not in a fantasy or in a dream. We know the truth. However, for that to happen, there has to be something that transcends both the doer and the observer of the doer, the person who has something proven to them. So that requires one more step of transcendence. It's called transcendent antecedent causation in technical philosophy. Sounds pretty, but it's just a fancy way of saying that there has to be something higher and common to both or all parties in order to prove objectivity. There has to be a higher common truth, and that these truth knowers share that same common truth in order for there to be objectivity. This means that there is a consciousness, a state of being, a truth that is common to both selves. And in the Rosicrucian philosophy, we call that life spirit. And we, in our selfhood, as foci of the selfness of life spirit, are focal points of that one common truth. We're trying to elucidate objective waking self-consciousness in plain English, in ways that we can experience, and in ways that in that experience we can awaken even more. Now, in Rosicrucian terminology, the individual being, the self, that is self-aware and that is capable of sharing with another self-aware being is called, in spirit, it's called the human spirit. And as seen from this side, it is called the spiritual ego. And unfortunately, the term ego has been polluted since the time of Max Heindel, and it has been distorted to mean something much different. It has more to do with the lower animal nature, the second self, the ego with a small e. Probably in our language in the 21st century, the self, or the true self, or the spiritual self is probably the best word in the English language if we want to communicate with other people and not just our own in-group. I don't think it is a sacrilege against Max Heindel to say that some of the words that were used when he wrote the Cosmoconception are not understood by people as meaning the same thing now over a century later, and that we should be willing to utilize words that are more appropriate for our time. Okay, so in Rosicrucian patois, objective waking self-consciousness is a result of the interplay between the human spirit and the life spirit. In common language, this is saying that the highest state of human consciousness is like a dialogue between the aspirant, the self, and the Christ. Christ being the representation or representative of life spirit. It's the universal self, or the selfness that is common to all separate selves. The waking state of consciousness in life spirit is in common language called Christ consciousness. In the plain, simple English we're trying to use, the state of consciousness in life spirit can be described in a way of consciousness being conscious of consciousness. There's something that it is complete and total in itself. It's a totally self-regenerative or creative space, and it's not something just separate. Now, this is not dogma or doctrine, and it's not confined to the Rosicrucian Fellowship, though the objective understanding it is very different in the Rosicrucian Fellowship. But if we go back into all ancient forms of mysticism, we find the same thing, that the self and the beyond self is where consciousness is developed between the interplay of those two. Now, it's important that the clear, objective spiritual self-consciousness that we're seeking is between the human spirit and the life spirit. That is, between self and Christ. The kind of thing that takes place in the imitation of Christ, or in those other works where a person is questioning, that they're put in mundane terms, but a person is questioning their very being in relationship to being or beingness in all beings. The human spirit and the life spirit have phenomenal vehicles of consciousness. And those phenomenal vehicles of consciousness are for the express purpose of manifesting spiritual consciousness and developing it. The human spirit, this brings us, actually, this is probably, in terms of consciousness, this is probably one of the most important sentences in all of Rosicrucian philosophy. The vehicle of the human spirit, of the self, is the desire body. The vehicle of the life spirit is the vital body. And it is repeated various times in the Rosicrucian philosophy, a really, really important sentence. If you get no other thing out of this talk tonight, remembering this sentence is the most important thing. It is stated that all consciousness is a consequence of the struggle between the desire body and the vital body. All consciousness is a consequence of the struggle between the desire body and the vital body. Now, you can modify that all you want. You can say at our time in evolution, or you can say that they're struggling for control of the dense physical body, or all of that. But basically, that is a simple statement. It is what Scott, who is not here tonight, would call a Rosieism. Now, the Rosicrucian philosophy teaches us that the effect of desire is hardening. For example, the Rosicrucian cosmoconception tells us that in the cosmological process, when the desire principle over a long period of the evolutionary creation, when the desire principle was supreme or dominant in this struggle, is when we precipitated the hard skeleton. Whereas when the vital principle was predominant, is more when we develop soft tissue, things like lungs and things like that. This is not only physical, it's psychological. A person who has a lot of desire indulgence develops what we call a hard personality. There's no kindness, there's no generosity in them. All they care about is satisfying. We do this, I do it myself. Satisfying this personal desire. There are problems if we are too extreme in the vital side of things, and we can lose incentive, and we can become plant-like and vegetate. But that's less of a danger right now than becoming too much in the desire principle. People with rich vital bodies are forgiving. And this is why part of the Rosicrucian motto is that we try to have a sane mind, a sound body, and a soft heart, so that we are willing to give. For that matter, the heart is the seat of the life spirit, the heart and the blood. That's the primary seat in the physical body. So the back and forth is between the desire body and the vital body is both long-term and it's short-term. Every time that we're eating dinner and the concept of dessert comes up, the struggle comes up. Go back and forth over it. It's not bad to have a struggle. In fact, it is in that struggle that we wake up. I've been in many discussion groups that are argument groups. And sometimes you wake up and come up with arguments just in the necessity of the moment that you wouldn't come up with otherwise. So the struggle isn't bad. You're conscious, your motivation might be a personal ego thing that you want to win the argument, but nonetheless, your consciousness is wakened. There are all kinds of examples in our daily lives that we can see how this works. So, when we know about this, we can self-consciously direct this struggle. And we can assimilate the fruits of this struggle, and we can learn from it because we know this is what comes out of this struggle. Eventually we learn other ways. When we have enough soul material, we learn by direct intuition from life spirit, and we don't have to struggle so much. My burden is light and my way is easy. So this is the most important thing when we're reviewing consciousness before dipping into unconsciousness. All consciousness is a consequence of the struggle between the desire body and the vital body. Now there's one more thing that I want to repeat. We're just about to be finished here. And it's something that you've heard me say many times before, and in these talks you're going to hear it more times again. And it is, our waking consciousness is a tiny island in a vast sea of unconsciousness. Our waking consciousness is a tiny little island in a vast sea of unconsciousness. One moment of consciousness of the higher worlds shows us how tiny and how small our world has been. Yes, we have consciousness of things like infinities and universal principles and things like that. And, we have infinities that fit inside of other infinities. But nonetheless, our consciousness is still very, very small. All right, now for the rest of these talks, we're going to take a minor voyage into the sea of unconsciousness, and hopefully we will be more aware and function better in our daily life, and that we can make our daily life to be more in tune with the whole evolutionary creation. So we're going to try and find practical things all along the way that improve our lives and improve things for other people. Because once we have the Christ way, once we understand the life spirit, we don't do things for ourselves alone. We emulate Christ, and Christ is the consciousness of the infinite other, so we don't do things for ourselves alone. If nothing else, hopefully we'll develop a few feelings of awe and of reverence and the splendor of the things that we are not conscious of now. We also want to have some fun along the way, so we'll try to do that too. But for now, we'll close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength, our Redeemer.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you.